Good evening. In fact, more than good evening. Great day. Let's light up the darkness. It's all in how you approach things. We've been working hard. I'm just a helper. Nina's been in charge of the project, turning over the house, getting ready for Pesach, for Passover. It's not just clearing out any kind of bread or flour products. It's clearing out all the utensils and plates and bowls and glasses and everything that we use in conjunction with chametz, right? Leavened dough, leavened flour, bread products during the year. It's a complete turnover of the house, and it's a daunting, difficult, challenging process. But if you just engage with it and think, wow, what an opportunity to do God's will, so then you turn it around and it just becomes something that you can enjoy and relish. So today I took both cars to get washed and vacuumed, get every trace of chametz out. Some new bowls and pots and pans that we needed, took them to the Toivel mikvah, right? We immerse those utensils in water so that they can be used in a Jewish home. And some of the silverware that it's possible to kosher for Pesach, taking it through boiling water. A couple of young guys, Chabad guys, who had these huge pots of boiling water, and they were taking baskets of silverware and running them through the boiling water. It's a wonderful process. And on top of all of that, over here, as I've mentioned many times, this is my edit bay for cutting the movie, Man in the Long Black Coat. About a rabbi who becomes a detective and faces some serious bad guys in an murder mystery action thriller. And today's the day. I'm cutting the last scene right now. So we'll complete the rough cut, which I've been working on for 2 months. And then next week, or the week after, we're going to bring in our Finnish editor, who I'm really excited about, who's got tremendous credits. But because I've been doing the rough cut myself, we're sort of much further along in the process. As the director, I had to select every performance and every structure of every scene, and that's going to be done. So when I start working with our Finnish editor, it's really going to be about refinement. So lots of reasons to be in a good mood. I hope you're having a great day too. Our daf is Sotah, page 4. Sotah is the 18th volume of the Talmud. We're in chapter 1, continuing our discussion of Mishna number 1. These are the laws of the suspected adulteress. Who's in the house? Stephen in New Hampshire, Melissa in Great Neck, Paula in the Great Northwest, Bella in Florida, Ira in Greenville, South Carolina, Sam in Virginia, exhausted from cleaning. I feel you, brother. Shandor in the Bronx, Lucy in Minnesota, Gosia in Chicago. That's a name I haven't seen before. Welcome, Gosia. Karen in Northern California, Joseph in Massachusetts, Joe in the Inland Empire, Nancy in North Carolina, Franco in Italy, Sharon, no notification. I guess Facebook didn't notify you, but thank God you found the show anyway. We're always on at 6 p.m. Pacific. However, so we're going to be on, we're obviously on at 6 p.m. Pacific. Tomorrow, Monday, Tuesday, regular time. Wednesday, Pesach, Passover starts Wednesday night. We're going to do our class odd time. Wednesday morning, 10 a.m. Pacific. We'll put that in the email bulletin, the AT email bulletin. You should be subscribed if you're not already. You can subscribe at accidentaltalmudist.org. That morning, we'll do the final passage from Tractate Nazir. We didn't make our siyum on Tractate Nazir, so we could save it and do it Wednesday morning. And I'm a firstborn, so that's going to excuse me from the fast of the firstborn, because we'll be making a Sudas mitzvah, a mitzvah meal in conjunction with celebrating our completion of Tractate Nazir. Then we're not going to have class again until a week from Sunday, right? So you'll see that in the schedule in the email. But bottom line, we have class regular time today, tomorrow, Tuesday, 10 a.m. Pacific on Wednesday. Okay. And over there on the YouTube side, Marjorie checking in from Georgia. Ella says shalom. Lynn in North Texas. Let's get into it. Our daf is daf Dalet, page 4, here in Tractate Sotah. We actually pick it up at the bottom of page 3b. I call today's show The Time It Takes to Circle a Palm Tree. I might have called it, I thought to call it a provocative euphemism. Same title. So as we shall see. Okay, here we go. All right, so the sages taught in the Mishna quoted above, and recall that we're talking about the procedure of the Sotah ritual. A husband has reason to suspect that his wife is spending, inappropriate time with a man who is not her husband. And so he warns her, do not seclude yourself with that man. Now, warning has no effect unless it's given in the presence of two witnesses. If given in the presence of two witnesses, she better not seclude herself with that particular man. If she does, and two witnesses witness that, then the husband and wife become prohibited to each other. They cannot be together as man and wife until she drinks the bitter water in the Sotah ritual, which can only be done in the Holy Temple when the temple is standing in Jerusalem. It hasn't in 2,000 years. That's why you don't do this. Don't give that warning. And if you get that warning, heed that warning. Because if a husband issues that warning and in front of two witnesses and the wife doesn't heed the warning and secludes herself, and that happens in front of two witnesses, they become prohibited to each other and there's no remedy. They cannot come back together. They'll have to divorce because you can't do the Sotah ritual in the absence of the temple. Now, they won't even have the opportunity to do the Sotah ritual if there's a witness to the fact that not only did she get the warning, two witnesses, and then she secluded herself with that man, two witnesses, and then someone saw her, and for that, one witness will do, after these other two stages in the process, if she actually slept with that man, committed adultery, had an affair, then the husband and wife must divorce. The Sotah ritual doesn't even apply if she actually was witnessed defiling herself. That's called the defilement. Okay, so now we're going to get into some, as the Talmud will always do, specifying what is the minimum measure for a law to apply. Minimum measures, specific measures, maximum measures. Here we're going to talk about the minimum amount of time for this seclusion with this man who's not her husband that she was warned not to seclude herself with. Well, what counts as seclusion? I mean, if they took an elevator ride together, is that seclusion? What counts as seclusion? So the sages taught, Tosefta 1:1, in the Mishna quoted above, which is the first testimony? This is referring to the testimony of seclusion, two witnesses. What is the final testimony? This is referring to the testimony of defilement. One witness will do only after there were two witnesses to both the warning and the seclusion. Otherwise, to cause a husband and wife to divorce because somebody saw the wife sleeping with another man, actually having sex with another man, that would require two witnesses. By the way, why don't we talk about a husband committing adultery and cheating on his wife, and how many witnesses are required for that, and would divorce be necessary? Well, that's not going to be a matter of Torah law, because when the Torah was given, husbands could have multiple wives. So, if he slept with a woman who is single, and who's not his wife, he better be prepared to marry her, because that would be the consequence of that. If he slept with a woman who is a married woman, well, that's a death penalty offense, like any other act of adultery, if witness testified, etc. At any rate, so now we're at the top of 4a. And what is the measure of seclusion? Meaning, how is the seclusion of a Sotah defined? The measure of seclusion is equivalent to the time needed for defilement, which is equivalent to the time needed to perform intercourse, which is equivalent to the time needed to perform the initial stage of intercourse. Now we're going to start defining this, how much time it takes for a woman to be secluded with this man that she was warned not to, and that we could consider that, it was an actual act of seclusion. And not surprisingly, it's going to be tied to, could they, not did they, we don't know if that was witnessed or not, but could they have performed the act of intercourse? If they were only together for a few seconds, even though she was warned not to seclude herself with that man, they couldn't have performed intercourse in that time, so that's not going to be considered an act of seclusion for these legal purposes. Okay, so it has to be enough time to perform intercourse. How long is that? Now they're going to talk about the initial act of intercourse. You might have thought that intercourse means, foreplay, the actual act, and taking that act to its completion. But that's not the definition of intercourse for this matter. The initial act of intercourse is enough. Like, once the sexual members of the man and woman do the thing, that's it. It's not that they have to spend a bunch of time doing it. Once they do it, they've done it, right? So the Baraisa quotes several practical examples of this period of time. And this is equivalent to, now you might have thought, well, the initial act of intercourse, now that's defined elsewhere in the Talmud. What does it mean, the initial act of intercourse? We defined it actually in Tractate Yevamos that it's, when the corona of the man's member enters the vagina. And so once that has happened, that's the initial act of intercourse, and that should be enough. You would think that they would just define that clearly here. But instead, they're going to use these interesting measures of time to help us understand how much time we're talking about. Right? So the Baraisa quotes several practical examples of what this measure of time would be. This is equivalent to the time needed for circling a palm tree. This is the statement of Rabbi Yishmael. Rabbi Eliezer says this is equivalent to the time needed for mixing a cup of wine with water, with the total volume of a revis, a quarter lug. Right, why would you mix wine with water? Because in ancient times, they always mixed wine with water. Wine, when it was made very strong and had to be diluted before it could be drunk in the normal course of things. So mixing a cup of wine, a regular sized cup of wine, that's the amount of time it takes. Rabbi Yehoshua says this is equivalent to the time needed to drink that cup of wine. And the Baraisa is going to give several more examples of this practical measure of time. Right? They didn't have, nice watches with sweep second hands, right? So they used these, practical measures that people could understand. So Ben Azai says this is equivalent to the time needed to roast an egg. And Rabbi Kiva says this is equivalent to the time needed to swallow an egg. Rabbi Yehuda ben Beteira says this is equivalent to the time needed to swallow 3 eggs, one after another. Rabbi Elazar ben Yirmiyah says this is equivalent to the time needed for a weaver, a gardi, to tie a string, nima. Chanin ben Pinchas says this is equivalent to the time that a woman may need to extend her hand into her mouth to remove a wood chip from between her teeth. And the sage Palemu says this is equivalent to the time that she may need to extend her hand into a basket in order to remove a loaf of bread. And he adds, although there is no explicit proof from a verse for the matter, there is an allusion to the matter from the verse, Proverbs 6:26, for on account of a harlot, a man is brought to a loaf of bread. And the Baraisa stated that the measure of seclusion is equivalent to the time needed for defilement, which is equivalent to the time needed to perform sexual intercourse, which is equivalent to the time needed to perform the initial stage of intercourse, and it added 9 practical examples of that length of time. So the Gemara asks, and why do I need all these measures of time when one should have sufficed? And the Gemara answers, well, all 3 are necessary: defilement, intercourse, the first stage of intercourse. All 3 are necessary. As if the Baraisa taught only equivalent to the time needed for defilement, I would say that the measure is equivalent to the time for her defilement and her appeasement. Appeasement, interesting word in this context, meaning the amount of time needed to convince her to engage in sexual intercourse, right? The amount of time needed for the seducer to seduce this hapless married woman. Therefore, the Baraisa teaches us that the measure is equivalent to the time needed to perform sexual intercourse alone. the talking and emotion and foreplay has nothing to do with the act. It's enough that they came together and had enough time to perform the act of sexual intercourse. And if the Brisa taught only the measure of seclusion is equivalent to the time needed to perform sexual intercourse, I would say that the measure is equivalent to the time needed for the complete act of intercourse. Therefore, the Brisa teaches us that the measure is equivalent to the time needed to perform only the initial stage of intercourse. And if the Brisa taught only the measure of seclusion is equivalent to the time needed to perform the initial stage of intercourse, I would say that the measure is equivalent to the time needed to perform the initial stage of intercourse and her appeasement, right? The seduction. Therefore, the Brisa teaches us that the measure is equivalent to the time needed for defilement, which does not include appeasement. And the Brisa concludes by offering a practical measure. And what is the measure of the equivalent amount of time needed to perform the initial stage of intercourse? It is equivalent to the time needed for circling a palm tree. Other sages then offered their own practical examples. We have lots of palm trees here in LA. What's different about a palm tree from other kinds of trees? Well, palm trees never get that big. They can get very tall, but it does not take very long to walk around the trunk of a palm tree. And the Gemara raises a contradiction from a different Brisa. In Tosefta 1:2. So the verse states, and she was defiled secretly in Numbers 5:13. And we have not heard what is the measure of seclusion. So when it says in that verse, and she was defiled secretly, you must say that the measure of seclusion is equivalent to the time needed for defilement, which is equivalent to the time needed to perform sexual intercourse, which is equivalent to the time needed to perform the initial stage of intercourse, which is equivalent to the time needed for the returning of a palm tree. This is the statement of Rabbi Eliezer, the returning of a palm tree. Not explained. The Brisa continues, Rabbi Yehoshua says this is equivalent to the time needed for mixing a cup of wine with water with the total volume of a quarter lug. And Ben Azai says the equivalent of time needed to drink that cup of wine. And Rabbi Kiva says the equivalent this is equivalent to the time needed to roast an egg. And Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira says this is equivalent to the time needed to swallow the egg. So the Gemara now addresses several contradictions between this Brisa, and the one quoted earlier. So the Gemara first comments, it might enter your mind to say that circling a palm tree is the same as the returning of a palm tree. And the Gemara asks, well, there in the first Brisa, Rabbi Yishmael says that it is equivalent, the amount of time needed for seclusion to be seclusion is equivalent to the time needed for circling a palm tree. And Rabbi Eliezer disagreed with him. While here in the second Brisa, Rabbi Eliezer himself says it is equivalent to the time needed for the returning of a palm tree. So doesn't this contradict what he said in the previous Brisa? And to resolve this contradiction, Abaye says, these measures are not the same, as circling is referring to the amount of time it takes for one to circle a palm tree by foot, and returning is referring to the amount of time it takes for a palm branch blown by the wind to revert to its prior position. Something like that. So Rav Ashi asks, this returning of the palm branch by the wind, is this the time only so that it goes forward with the wind and returns to the place one time, not including the time it is still moving back and forth due to the wind? Or perhaps it is the time so that it goes forward with the wind and comes back and returns until it settles in its place. Taiku, this question shall be left unresolved. So the Gemara presents another contradiction. There in the first Brisa, Rabbi Eliezer says, this is equivalent to the time needed for pouring a cup of wine. Here in the second Brisa, he says, this is equivalent to the time needed for the returning of a palm tree. The Gemara answers, this and that are one, i.e. these are the same measure. Another contradiction. Rabbi Yehoshua says, this is equivalent to the time needed for drinking a cup of wine. In the second Brisa, he says, equivalent to the time needed for mixing a cup of wine. And the Gemara answers, say that he requires both together. He requires an amount of time equivalent to the time needed to both mix and drink a cup of wine. And the Gemara asks, instead of combining the measures, why not let us say that this and that are one measure? And the Gemara answers, if so, this is the same as the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer in the first Brisa, with whom Rabbi Yehoshua disagrees. Now, let's just observe for a moment whatever the measure is, the final measure, this is not a long amount of time, right? And we're not saying that, they're very fast at making love. So fast, right? I mean, pouring a cup of wine, mixing water into wine. How long could that possibly take? 10 seconds, 15 seconds, 20 seconds? Okay, some people make love very fast, but this is so fast that what they're really saying is, the husband warned the wife not to seclude herself with that man. The minimum measure is going to be very small of how long it takes that she secluded herself with that man, and so it counts as a seclusion that violates the warning that her husband issued. Right. And the Gemara presents another contradiction. There in the first Baraisa, Ben Azai says, this is equivalent to the time needed to roast an egg. And in the second Baraisa, he says, equivalent to the time needed to drink a cup of wine. And the Gemara says, yeah, this and that are the same answer. So another contradiction there. In the first Baraisa, Rabbi Akiva says, equivalent to the time needed to swallow an egg. In the second Baraisa, he says, equivalent to the time needed to roast an egg. Gemara says these are the same. Gemara asks, instead of combining the measures, the Gemara says that in Rabbi Akiva's case, this is equivalent to the time needed to roast an egg and swallow it. And the Gemara asks, instead of combining the measures, why not let us say that this and that are the same measure? And the Gemara answers, if so, this is the same as the opinion of Ben Azai in the first Baraisa, with whom Rabbi Akiva disagrees. Just thinking, roast an egg, that sounds to me like a much longer amount of time than what's needed to eat an egg. I wonder what they mean by roast an egg. I mean, like when you roast an egg, the roasted egg for Passover, that's like a hard-boiled egg, goes in the oven. I wonder what they actually mean by roast an egg, because it certainly sounds like a lot more time than what it takes to pour water into wine. Another contradiction. There in the Baraisa, Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira says equivalent to the time needed to swallow 3 eggs one after another. In the second Baraisa, he says equivalent to the amount of time needed to swallow an egg, meaning 1 egg. So the Gemara answers, in the first Baraisa, he did not state his own opinion, but stated his opinion in accordance with that of Rabbi Akiva, who stated that one measures according to the time needed for roasting and swallowing. So Rabbi Yehoshua responded, say instead the measure of the time needed for swallowing alone, i.e. an amount of time equivalent to the time needed to swallow 3 eggs one after another, which is equal to the amount of time necessary for roasting and swallowing. Roasting, I guess, is pretty quick. It's the amount of time that it takes to eat 2 eggs, plus the 3rd egg now. And therefore, Rabbi Akiva would not need to include roasting in the measurement. So the Gemara discusses an opinion cited in the first Baraisa. Rabbi Elazar ben Yirmiyah says, this is equivalent to the time needed for a weaver to tie a string. And Rav Ashi says, is this speaking of where the ends of the string to be tied are far apart from each other? Or is it speaking of where they are near to each other? Taiku, let it stand unresolved. Gemara discusses another opinion in the first Baraisa. Again, let's take a step back for a second. I mean, we're reading one opinion after another opinion after another opinion after another opinion. How long does it take, the minimum amount of time, that this adulteress and her adulterer lover were secluded so that we could so that we could not assume that they did make love, but that they could have, that they had enough time that if they were, I guess, really motivated, they could have made love. But remember, it's not the complete act of making love. It's just the act of getting started making love. In other words, penetration. And at that point, they would have committed adultery, and she should not have secluded herself with him that long. Now imagine the sages sitting in the study hall, working this out. I can promise you that they're not sitting there going wink, wink, snicker, snicker. Here we are in the study hall talking about salacious topics. No, they're very serious and working out what is the minimum measure of this, in the same way that they would work out what is the minimum measure that if some piece of dairy, some piece of cheese fell into a beef stew, what's the minimum measure that it would render that a prohibited mixture of milk and meat, and that would render the whole stew that perhaps somebody worked on for many hours and shopped for and spent money on, and would render it prohibited and nullified, and not nullified, but it would render it prohibited, and so that it would have to be thrown out and no Jew could eat it. right? I mean, this is a practical question that they are going to really apply their sechel, their all of their mentality and experience and knowledge to working out these answers. Why? Why do they take it so seriously on any kind of a question, whether we're talking about cooking or lovemaking or immersing in a mikveh, and how big does the mikveh have to be, and how far do you have to walk on Shabbos when you're carrying something to violate Shabbos? Why are they always working out these kinds of minimum measures? Because they are passionate about understanding God's will, right? The sages will spend many pages. In fact, tomorrow's daf is a very beautiful spiritual page working out the cure for arrogance, working out how dangerous arrogance is to a person in this world, and how he can cure himself of arrogance. Now that's a beautiful spiritual teaching, but they're going to apply the same kind of industriousness and thoroughness to working out minimum measures of any law that they are talking about. And I find that very inspiring, right? The passion to understand God's will and apply it to every aspect of our lives, because the idea is that overriding philosophy, you could say, of Judaism and of Torah is that we don't separate, our spiritual life, that we go and pray in synagogue and that's where we pray, and then there's the rest of our lives where we just go about our business. No. In every aspect of life, in every nook and cranny of the lives we lead in this world, there is a way to perform God's will or a way not to perform God's will. So that's why it matters so much. We said that one. Right, so they keep doing these contradictions between these two different baraisas, where the same rabbis seem to give a different measure in one baraisa versus the other of what is the minimum amount of time for seclusion of the adulterous to count as seclusion. So here's another one. So Hanin ben Pinchas says this according to the time that a woman may need to extend her hand into her mouth to remove a wood chip from between her teeth. I think like a toothpick. That broke and left a little wood in her mouth. So Rav Ashi asks, is this speaking of a case where the wood chip is stuck between her teeth, or is it speaking of a case where it is not stuck? Right? They're being so specific, and there's no answer to that question. Taiku. And the Gemara discusses another opinion in the first baraisa, where Palemu says this amount of time is equivalent to the amount of time that a woman may need to extend her hand into a basket to remove a loaf of bread. And Rav Ashi asks, is this speaking of an occasion where the loaf adheres to the basket, or is it speaking of a case where it does not adhere? Is this speaking of a case where the basket is new, whereby the tips of the shoots forming the basket might restrain the loaf? Or is this speaking of a basket that is old and smooth, enabling easy removal? Is this speaking of a case where the loaf is hot and therefore softer and it may adhere to the basket? Or is this speaking of a case where the loaf is cold and easily removed? Is this, and now we're on 4b, is it speaking of a case where the loaf is made of wheat, which is slippery and takes longer to remove? Or is this speaking of a case where the loaf is made of barley, where it is more easily removed? Are we talking about a loaf that is soft or a loaf that is hard? And all these questions shall stand unresolved. Taiku. The Gemara notes, Rabbi Yitzchak bar Rav Yosef says that Rabbi Yochanan says each and every one of these sages who presented an opinion with regard to the time needed for the initial stage of intercourse estimated based on himself, i.e. based on his own experience, how long it takes to achieve the initial stage of intercourse. And the Gemara asks, but then there is Ben Azai, who did not marry. So how could he estimate based on his own experience? It's a given that this sage, who is a tzaddik, a righteous person, since he never married, he never made love to a woman. He wouldn't have visited a prostitute. He wouldn't have had extramarital sex. So he must have never had sex in his life. So how does he know how long the initial stage of intercourse takes? And the Gemara answers, well, if you wish, say that he was married and then he separated from his wife. So we didn't know. We were wrong that he never married. And if you wish, say that he heard from his teacher. And if you wish, say his knowledge can be understood based on the verse, Psalm 25, verse 14. The counsel of the Lord is with them that fear him, teaching that those who fear God are privy to knowledge beyond their personal experience. Now, having quoted an allusion from the verse earlier, we said that there's an allusion to this, how long does the initial stage of intercourse take? The one who said that it's related to how long it takes to pull a loaf of bread out of a basket, that there's a hint of that in the Bible at Proverbs 6:26. For on account of a harlot, a man is brought to a loaf of bread. But the Gemara offers a different interpretation of that verse. Rav Avira interpreted that verse homiletically, that there were times he said this interpretation in the name of Rabbi Ami, and there were times when he said it in the name of Rabbi Asi. And concerning anyone who eats bread without washing his hands, it is as if he engaged in sexual intercourse with a prostitute. As it is stated, for on account of a harlot, a man is brought to a loaf of bread. Recall that what we're talking about here is that when you eat bread, so it is bread that defines a meal as a meal, right? If you eat food, but there's no bread with it, so that's like a snack, even if you ate a lot of food. If you eat bread with your meal, even though that's a very small amount of food along with your piece of bread, then it is a meal. If you're having a meal, so two things happen. One is you must wash your hands before you eat it. And you have to do that with a minimum measure of water, which is the revis, a quarter lug of water. You say a bracha, a blessing over the washing of the hands. Then you say a blessing over the eating of the bread, which covers the rest of the meal. And after your meal, you have to say the grace after the meal, which is kind of an extended blessing that you say after the meal. And all these things are triggered by eating bread, right? If you don't eat bread with your meal, you still have to say a blessing over the food that you eat. You can't eat anything without saying a blessing. And then there's a shortened blessing after that eating, much shorter than the grace after a full meal that includes bread. At any rate, we've learned at the first tractate of the Talmud Brachos that one who partakes of any food in this world without first saying a blessing, it is as if he stole from God, right? You have to acknowledge that God allows you to eat. And if you don't say a blessing before eating, it's like you're a thief, that you stole from God, right? Because you didn't properly acknowledge the Holy One above. Now, we're extending this metaphor and also saying that one who eats without washing, not only is he like a thief, it is like one who, pays for sex from a prostitute, which is certainly a very wicked thing to do. So what does it say, right? It is as if he engaged in sexual intercourse with a prostitute. As it is stated, for on account of a harlot, a man is brought to a loaf of bread. Rava said, this phrase, for on account of a harlot, a man is brought to a loaf of bread, that is not how the verse would present this idea, right? It's not that eating bread without a blessing is like frequenting a prostitute. Rather, the phrase, for on account of a harlot, a man is brought to a loaf of bread, should be understood differently. If it was meant to be understood the way you're saying, Rav Avira, the verse in the Proverbs would have said, on account of a loaf, a man is brought to a harlot. Rather, says Rava, anyone who engages in sexual intercourse with a harlot will eventually be reduced to poverty and beg people for a loaf of bread. Now, the Gemara continues its discussion of washing hands. Rabbi Zerika says that Rabbi Elazar says anyone who treats the ritual of washing hands, right, before eating a meal with bread, is uprooted from the world, right? It means he'll have an early death. Rav Chia bar Ashi says that Rav says, with regard to the first water, meaning the water that when you wash your hands before a meal, one must raise his hands upward after washing. With regard to last water, right, the mayim acharonim, the waters afterward, right? So not everybody does this, even in the Orthodox Jewish world, but it's certainly a Hasidic custom, and it was an ancient custom that after the meal, you would also wash your fingertips, right? And we learned out earlier in our journey why, because sometimes they would use salt from Sodom, which is a very kind of potent salt. And if that got on your fingertips and then you rubbed your eyes, you could really hurt yourself. So it became a custom to rinse your fingertips after. You don't say a blessing over the waters afterward. But at any rate, what is the correct way to wash hands before and to rinse fingers afterward? That when you wash your hands before the meal, you run the water over them, and then you have to lift your hands up. And when you do the fingertips afterward, you have to lower your hands down. Why? Right, so with regard to the last water, one must lower his hands downward. And this distinction is also taught in a Baraisa. One who washes his hands before a meal must raise his hands upward after washing, lest the water advance past the joint onto the part of the hands that he has not required to wash, and then become impure, and then return to the area that he had washed, rendering his hands ritually impure. Right? Meaning, you wash your hands, some water went up to your, wrist, where the part of your hand that you didn't wash properly, so that part of the hand was impure, and then you just let it down. Now that water with the impurity goes back down to the hand you just washed and renders you impure. Now, you don't have to do this in modern times if you wash properly using at least the revis of water and make sure that you rinse each side well. But those who are stringent do have the custom, and we do this, that when you wash your hands, you lift your hands up afterwards. That is the correct way to do it. Although if you didn't do that, you still can be say that your yot say that you fulfilled your obligation to wash hands. But it's better to raise your hands after you wash. And Rabbi Abahu says anyone who eats bread without wiping his hands dry after washing them causes the bread to become repulsive and is considered as if you were eating impure bread, since the verse refers to repulsive bread as impure bread, as it is stated, Ezekiel 4:13, and the Lord said, even thus shall the children of Israel eat their bread unclean among the nations where I will drive them. Right? In other words, a warning that the Jews, because they're misbehaving, will be driven out of the land of Israel, and then they'll have to be in exile, as we are. And in exile, it'll be difficult to maintain purity and to fulfill the commandments properly. And one of the examples of that is that you will end up eating your bread unclean. And eating bread with wet hands is now, explained that that's what Ezekiel meant. Eating bread with wet hands causes the bread to become repulsive. And the verse deems eating in an uncouth manner, as did the non-Jews among whom the Jewish people were exiled, as akin to eating ritually impure bread. The Gemara now continues the interpretation of the above quoted verse. For on account of a harlot, a man is brought to a loaf of bread. Again, Proverbs 6:26. And the Gemara asks, and what is the meaning of the continuation of that verse? But the adulterous hunts for the precious life. And Rabbi Chia bar Abba says that Rabbi Yochanan says any person who has arrogance within him will eventually stumble by sinning with an adulteress. As it is stated, but the adulteress hunts for the precious life. She sins with one who considers himself precious. And Rava said this phrase, the precious life, is not how the verse would present such an idea. It would have said an arrogant life. And further, it should have stated a precious life she hunts for the adulteress, indicating that the precious soul will entrap the adulteress and not vice versa, as the verse indicates as written. Rather, says Rava, that the verse should be interpreted like this. Anyone who engages in sexual intercourse with an adulteress, even if that man studied Torah, about which it is written, she is more precious than rubies. The Torah study is more precious than rubies. Proverbs 3:15, which based on its etymological connection with the Hebrew term for the Holy of Holies, lifnei velifnim, is interpreted by the sages to mean that one who studies Torah is more precious than a high priest, a Kohen Gadol, who enters the innermost sanctum, the Holy of Holies, on Yom Kippur. Still, this transgression of adultery will entrap him into the judgment of Gehenna, and the Torah he studied will not be able to save him. Right? So they're saying that this sin of adultery, terrible, wicked sin, and even one who spends all his days studying Torah, for which he should accrue tremendous merit that will stand him well when he leaves this world and goes to the world to come, if despite all that Torah study and accruing all that merit, he also commits the wicked sin of adultery, he's going to have to pay for that, right? And he's going to end up in Gehenna. Now, Gehenna, the sort of English terms, we might liken it to the concept of purgatory. Gehenna is not a permanent place unless you're a severely wicked person. But most people in the world, who had, we've got lots of good deeds that we've done, lots of mitzvahs that we performed in our lives, but we've also had transgressions. So we'll be held accountable, and we might have to spend some amount of time in Gehenna. Who knows how much that time will seem like, but it will be finite, right? And then we'll go on to the world to come. But remember that in the Jewish scheme of the afterlife, it's not binary, right? It's not, heaven or hell. If you're in heaven, boom, all amazing. Everyone has the same portion in heaven. And if you're in hell, you're there forever, and everyone has the same portion there. No. Depending on how you lead your life is what your portion will be like in the afterlife. In other words, there's infinite gradations. You get to heaven, you get to the world to come, but there's, sort of basically how close you get to the throne of glory depends on what kind of a life you led here, right? So there's always a reason to do one more mitzvah because it'll stand you 1 degree closer in the world to come. But what they're telling you is that this sin of adultery is just a huge demerit that can really harm you in the world, in the afterlife. So Rabbi Yochanan says in the name of Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, any person who has arrogance within him is considered as if he were an idol worshiper, which is probably, basically adultery, murder, and idol worship are the big three. Right? Those are the 3 biggest sins that will cause you the most punishment in the afterlife. So any person who has arrogance within him is like an idol worshiper, right? They're telling you that arrogance is a terrible transgression in this world. A lot of us would think, well, I'm not going to commit murder. I'm not going to commit adultery. I'm not going to worship idols. I must be in good shape. But how many of us can say we've never acted in an arrogant manner? How many of us can say we've never felt arrogance? So we really have to be careful to remove arrogance from our person. It's that big a deal. It's like idol worship. How do we know? As is written here, everyone that is proud in heart is an abomination to the Lord. Proverbs 16:5. And it is written there concerning the destruction of idols, and you shall not bring an abomination into your house. That's the connection between arrogance and idolatry, this word abomination. And Rabbi Yochanan said, his own statement, any person who has arrogance within him is considered as if he has denied the core belief in God's existence. As it is stated, then your heart be lifted up and you forget the Lord your God, right? When you become arrogant, you become full of yourself. And if you're full of yourself, there's no space for God, right? Where does God enter a person? Wherever we let him, right? So wherever we let God in is where God comes in. We have to make space within ourselves. That's why you got to be humble. That's why you have to be humble. That's why you have to be humble. That's why you have to be humble, to make space for God in you. Rabbi Chama Bar Chanina says, any person who has arrogance within him is considered as if he engaged in sexual intercourse with all of those with whom relations are forbidden. In other words, like incest, right? It's like being arrogant is like committing incest. As it is written here, everyone who is proud in heart is an abomination to the Lord, and it is written there, for all these abominations have the men of the land done, right? So the Canaanites were engaging in incest and all kinds of forbidden sexual practices, committing adultery, bestiality, etc. O'Ula says any person who has arrogance within him is considered as if he built a personal altar for idol worship. As it is stated, cease you from man in whose nostrils there is breath, for how little bame is he to be accounted. Isaiah 2:22. This word bame, referring to an arrogant person, do not read the verse as it is written, bame, how little, but rather read it as bama, altar, right? A personal altar as opposed to the altar in the holy temple. It's forbidden even to bring sacrifices to God on your own personal altar, let alone to some idol. Having interpreted the phrase, everyone who is proud in heart is an abomination to the Lord, the Gemara interprets the continuation of the verse. What is the meaning of hand to hand, he shall not be unpunished? Rav said, anyone who engages in sexual intercourse with an adulteress, even if he were to have attributed possession of heaven and earth to the Holy One, blessed be he, just as Abraham our father did. In other words, even if he was like Abraham, who on his own, in a world full of idolaters, came to the realization that there is a God, that God created everything, that God is our God. It's an incredible thing that Abraham did, right? Because Abraham did that. He merited to have all the Jewish people descend from him. And not only the Jewish people, right? All the monotheistic peoples come from Abraham. What an incredible accomplishment for Abraham to merit such a thing. But even if you did that, but then you also had sexual intercourse with an adulteress, about him it says, I have lifted up my hand to the Lord God Most High, maker of heaven and earth. He will not be unpunished from the judgment of Gehenna. Abraham is described as one whose hands were lifted up to declare the glory of God. Yet this verse declares that even one who engaged in forbidden sexual intercourse were to use his hands in the same way, still, due to his sin, the verse says he shall not go unpunished. I'm almost done. If you have questions or comments, get them in. This interpretation poses a difficulty to the sages of the school of Rabbi Shelah. This phrase, hand to hand, he shall not go unpunished, is not how the verse would present this idea, they say. It should have stated my hand, as that is the term employed in the verse with regard to Abraham. Rather, the sages of the school of Rabbi Shelah say, this teaches that even if one who engages in sexual intercourse with an adulteress had received the Torah from the hand of God, like Moses, our teacher, did, that it is written with regard to him, at his right hand was the fiery law unto them, Deuteronomy 33:2, i.e., God gave the Torah from his right hand unto the hand of Moses in order to give to the Jewish people, right? So even one who received the Torah from God himself, if he also had sex with an adulteress, what would become of him? He would be punished. He shall not be unpunished from the judgment of Gehenna. And this interpretation also poses a difficulty to Rabbi Yochanan. This phrase, hand to hand, is not how the verse would present such an idea. It should have stated hand from hand, as that is the term employed in the verse with regard to Moses. So rather, Rabbi Yochanan says, even if the one who committed adultery performs charitable deeds secretly, which is a very high good, giving money to charity, anonymously allowing others to have what they need, and being so humble and selfless about it. As you do it anonymously, you don't want to be recognized or thanked. It's enough that they get what they need. You don't need any kind of praise or recognition for it. It's a very high thing to give anonymously. So even if the one who committed adultery also performs charitable deeds secretly, as alluded to in the phrase hand to hand, and even if one might think that one who does so will go unpunished, as it is written with regard to charity of this kind, a gift in secret pacifies wrath, like it might pacify the wrath of the Lord. Nevertheless, one who sleeps with an adulteress, he will not go unpunished from the judgment of Gehenna. Have we made it clear? Don't commit adultery. Okay, let's see if we've got some questions or comments. On Sotah, page 4. Ira, what happens if the wife is having an affair with one of the two witnesses? Did they have two witnesses since one of the witnesses is guilty? That's a great question. What I would say about that is that would not count as a witness, right? Because what's the point of a witness? A witness is coming to court to testify that she did this, right? That's what it means. So why would a witness testify that she had sex with me, right? It doesn't work because you're not a witness against yourself. Like by definition, I'm pretty sure, I recall this, that's not just an American legal principle, it's a Torah principle that you don't bear witness against yourself, right, in a rabbinic court. So since he's involved in the act, I don't think that he could count as one of the two witnesses against her. I could be wrong. I'm not a rabbi, but that is my impression. Lucy, so is there one false witness that accuses the wife of adultery? The Sotah is not allowed, and there's no way she can question that accusation. But remember, that's only in the context of there were two witnesses that the husband warned her, and there were two witnesses that she secluded herself despite that warning. So we've got two witnesses to both stages of this process. The testimony of the single witness is only accepted in that context to say, and then she slept with the guy too. So at that point, they have to divorce, and they're not going to be able to do the Sotah ritual to be permitted to each other again. But we don't accept the testimony of a single witness who just comes and says, hey, I saw her sleeping with some guy. No, that testimony is not accepted. Joseph says, now that it has been mentioned, there is a verse that states that adultery is a capital offense. I'm a little confused. If it is proven that they must divorce, but elsewhere it is a capital offense, maybe it's two different situations. Right, well, it is a capital offense, but remember how capital offenses go, right? Capital offense actually becomes a death penalty situation where it wasn't just witnesses, but there were witnesses to the warning that someone said to you before, committing idolatry, for example. If you worship that idol, you are liable to the death penalty, and then the person does it immediately, and the witnesses see that. Right? And then they come to court and testify about him. That's when the death penalty comes in. The fact that something is a capital offense doesn't mean that the death penalty is going to be applied. It's almost never applied, right? Murder is something else. Murder, we don't need the warning like that, right? I think murder is something else. And murder and idolatry and adultery are likened to each other. We'll get more into, when the death penalty actually happened and when it didn't happen. But remember that in terms of a rabbinic court actually sentencing someone to die and then they're killed, we learn in Tractate Sanhedrin that a court that sentences someone to the death penalty once in 70 years is considered a murderous court, a bloody court, right? That's how rare it was that we would give the death penalty. But this idea that, two witnesses saw a woman commit adultery, actually have sex with a man, and then they report this to the husband and to the community, and now they need to be divorced. I mean, that's not such a difficult consequence to accept, right? I mean, you don't want to be married to somebody that cheats on you. And it's not just that you don't want, it's that it becomes prohibited for them to be together. And finally, Karen, are the two sets of witnesses the same? Or can they be, or need they be, four different people? Yeah, I'm not sure. I believe that they can be the same, right? They're different moments in time. So we don't see any requirement that they have four different witnesses, just that there were two people who saw the warning given and two people who saw that she secluded herself with this man, that specific man about whom the warning was issued, after the warning was issued. We need two for that. Can it be the same two? Probably. It doesn't seem to have been addressed, but we still have a long way to go through Tractate Sotah. That's what I've got for us today. With God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow.